The first president to face an assassination attempt was Andrew Jackson. In early 1835, Jackson paid a visit to the Capitol building to pay respects for the recently deceased Congressman Warren Davis. Waiting for Jackson outside the Capitol was an unemployed and deranged man named Richard Lawrence, who hoped to use the funeral service as an opportunity to put the president in an early grave. Lawrence had become increasingly mentally unstable in the past few years, eventually coming to believe that Jackson had killed his father and that he was King Richard III, a king of England from the 15th century. As the King of England, Lawrence believed he was entitled to money from his American colonies, but because of Jackson's refusal to recharter the national bank, the money was being withheld from him. As the president exited the Capitol, Lawrence sprung out from behind a pillar and fired his pistol directly at him, but the pistol misfired. The notoriously hot-tempered Jackson noticed his would-be assassin and charged at him with his cane. Lawrence then pulled out another loaded pistol, aimed it at the president, and pulled the trigger, but once again, it misfired. By then, Jackson had closed the distance between himself and Lawrence and began beating him with his cane until bystanders intervened. Following the almost assassination, Jackson accused a political rival, Whig Party Senator George Poindexter, of hiring Lawrence, while the Whigs claimed Jackson staged the incident to garner public sympathy. In reality, Lawrence acted alone. At his trial, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity after just 5 minutes of deliberation, and he lived the rest of his life in an asylum. But not all presidential assassins fail. President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, causing Vice President Theodore Roosevelt to ascend to the presidency. Following the assassination, a man named John Schrank claimed the ghost of William McKinley had visited him in a dream and told him that Roosevelt was behind his assassination. Just over a decade later, Roosevelt was in the midst of running for a third term as president in the 1912 election when Schrank was supposedly visited by McKinley's ghost once again. This time, McKinley ordered Schrank to avenge his murder by assassinating Roosevelt. Schrank would begin stalking Roosevelt across the campaign trail, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment would arrive on October 14th after Roosevelt arrived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As Roosevelt left his hotel to give a speech at an auditorium, a crowd of supporters swarmed him as he approached his car. Roosevelt stopped to acknowledge the crowd, but, unbeknownst to him, Schrank lurked amongst them. From just a few feet away, Schrank blasted Roosevelt with a pistol. Roosevelt fell back while his stenographer tackled Schrank to the ground, preventing him from firing again. A mob then gathered around Schrank, but Roosevelt, who miraculously survived the gunshot, called on them to spare Schrank's life. After police took Schrank away, Roosevelt went to the auditorium to give his speech, revealing to a shocked audience that he had just been shot. Speaking of which, how did he survive? Luckily for Roosevelt, the bullet had been fired at his chest, where it was slowed down by his steel eyeglass container and a folded copy of his 50-page speech held in his breast pocket. Roosevelt, an avid hunter with some anatomical knowledge, knew that the bullet hadn't penetrated his lung because he wasn't coughing blood, explaining his decision to give the speech before receiving medical attention. Despite his miraculous survival, Roosevelt went on to lose the election, while Schrank was confined to a mental institution for the remainder of his life. Teddy Roosevelt's distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected president in 1932, and he too was nearly assassinated. During the 1932 election, the United States was going through the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in history. Millions were unemployed, impoverished, and starving, and the government's seeming inability to adequately respond to the crisis created a sense of resentment amongst the public. FDR promised a New Deal for America and supported major government intervention to alleviate the Depression, rhetoric which resonated with the public, allowing him to surf to victory in the election. In early 1933, a month before his inauguration, Roosevelt gave a speech in Miami. Because of his paralysis, Roosevelt delivered the speech from the back seat of an open-top car, making him a vulnerable target. Hidden in the large crowd of spectators was an unhinged and unemployed man named Giuseppe Zangara, an anarchist, with a gun. Zangara hated how the rich and powerful treated the poor, with the Great Depression being, in his eyes, evidence of the failings of capitalism. While Zangara had nothing against FDR personally, he hated the system he represented and made it his mission to kill him. Once Roosevelt finished his speech, Zangara fired 5 shots in his direction before being subdued by the people around him. One bullet would have hit Roosevelt, but it was blocked by Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who just so happened to walk in front of FDR as Zangara began blasting. Supposedly, after Cermak was shot, he told FDR, "I'm glad it was me instead of you," though most historians doubt this ever happened. The other 4 bullets each hit a bystander, but luckily, all 4 survived. However, Cermak would succumb to his injury, spawning false rumors that Zangara was a Chicago gangster who purposefully targeted Cermak because of the mayor's desire to crack down on organized crime. Zangara would be tried for and found guilty of the murder of Cermak and was executed by the electric chair 5 weeks later. FDR's presidential successor, Harry Truman, also lived through an assassination attempt. On November 1st, 1950, 2 Puerto Rican nationalists, Oscar Collazo and Gracilio Torresola, hunted for Truman through Washington, D.C. The pair were members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, which, days earlier, had organized a series of uprisings in Puerto Rico, in American territory since 1898. The brief rebellion was quashed, but news of American military reprisals against the rebels in Torresola's hometown of Jayuya motivated the duo to assassinate the president. At the time, the White House was undergoing major renovations, and Truman was staying in the Blair House, which is usually served as the president's guest house. Collazo and Torresola walked up to the Blair House and opened fire on the president's security detail. After Collazo shot a police officer in the knee, he rushed to the stairs leading up to the house, but was quickly incapacitated by Secret Service agents emerging from inside. Meanwhile, Torresola gunned down Secret Service agent Leslie Kofelt. Amidst the commotion, Truman stuck his head out of the second-story window to see what was going on, until Secret Service agents yelled at him to get down. Luckily for Truman, Torresola had been in the middle of reloading his weapon. Kofelt, on the brink of death, then shot and killed Torresola, bringing an end to the assassination attempt. Unfortunately, Kofelt soon died of his injuries, becoming the only Secret Service agent in history to die while protecting the president from an assassin. Collazo was sentenced to death, but Truman, who believed he had never been in serious danger, commuted Collazo's sentence to life in prison. Decades later, President Jimmy Carter commuted Collazo's sentence further, and Collazo was eventually released from prison. In 1952, Truman supported a referendum in Puerto Rico regarding the island's status in the United States. Over 80% of voters supported remaining a territory of the U.S., but notably, independence was not an option on the ballot. A decade after the assassination attempt on Truman, John Fitzgerald Kennedy won the presidential election of 1960, becoming the first Catholic to be elected president. However, anti-Catholic sentiment was widespread in the United States at the time, which culminated in Kennedy's near assassination just a month after his victory. A former postal worker from New Hampshire named Richard Pavlik sold all of his belongings and began stalking Kennedy across the country in his 1950 Buick. Pavlik periodically sent postcards to Postmaster Thomas Murphy back in New Hampshire, who was aware of Pavlik's hatred towards Kennedy. When Murphy realized that each postcard was postmarked from a city Kennedy happened to be visiting, he contacted the authorities and informed them to look out for a 1950 Buick with a New Hampshire license plate. Regardless, Pavlik managed to track Kennedy down to Palm Beach, Florida. Unlike most other wannabe assassins who relied on firearms, Pavlik chose an alternative method. He loaded his car with dynamite and planned on ramming it into Kennedy's limo. This plan came shockingly close to fruition on December 11th, when Pavlik saw Kennedy leaving his family's vacation home to go to church. However, Pavlik had a last-minute change of heart when he noticed Kennedy's wife and children were with him. Pavlik was unwilling to kill the whole family and decided to bide his time until Kennedy was alone. This opportunity would never come because Pavlik was pulled over for a traffic violation and the police recognized his vehicle as a certain 1950 Buick with a New Hampshire license plate. After Pavlik was detained, police found the dynamite in his car and a manifesto in his hotel room. In the manifesto, Pavlik expressed his anti-Catholic bigotry and stated his belief that Kennedy, the scion of a wealthy family, had bought the presidency. He also made clear his willingness to lay down his own life to stop Kennedy from becoming president. A judge found Pavlik to be too incompetent to stand trial, and he bounced between various mental institutions until charges were dropped in 1966. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th president, having narrowly managed to escape death. While Kennedy may have escaped assassination once, Gerald Ford, who ascended to the presidency in 1974, evaded assassination twice just a year into his term. Whilst visiting Sacramento, California, Ford encountered the first assassin, a woman named Lynette Fromme, as he approached the California State Capitol building. Fromme pulled a gun on the president but never fired because she hadn't chambered a bullet, and she was quickly apprehended by the Secret Service. Fromme had been a member of the Manson family cult and hoped killing Ford would curry favor with Charles Manson. Additionally, Fromme was passionate about environmental issues and may have attempted to kill Ford to raise awareness for environmentalism. However, Fromme herself strangely insisted that she never intended to kill Ford. She was imprisoned until 2009, when she was released on parole. The second assassination attempt took place just 17 days later in San Francisco. After Ford gave a speech to the World Affairs Council, a woman named Sarah Jane Moore shot at Ford twice as he was walking towards his limo and waving at the crowd. Moore hoped that assassinating Ford would stir up social unrest and trigger a revolution. However, Moore was using a firearm she was unfamiliar with, and her first shot narrowly missed Ford's head by 5 inches. As she prepared to fire a second time, a former Marine named Oliver Sipple grabbed her arm, causing the bullet to hit the pavement and ricochet into a taxi driver. Moore was quickly taken into custody by the Secret Service and was imprisoned until 2007, when she was released on parole. Oliver Sipple, the Marine who potentially saved Ford's life, was heralded as a national hero, though Sipple disliked all the media attention. Unfortunately for Sipple, the media soon found out that he was gay after Sipple's close associate, gay rights activist Harvey Milk, outed him to the public. Homosexuality was viewed very negatively at the time, but Milk believed that outing the president's savior would legitimize the gay rights movement in the eyes of the public. However, Sipple himself did not want to reveal his sexuality. His family soon disowned him, and despite Ford writing him a public letter thanking him for his actions, Sipple fell into alcoholism and was diagnosed with schizophrenia before his death in 1989. Ford's two would-be assassins, Fromme and Moore, are the only women to ever attempt to kill the president. However, one man, John Hinckley Jr., attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan in a deranged bid to impress a woman. Specifically, Hinckley became obsessed with actress Jodie Foster, who he had seen in the movie Taxi Driver. On March 30th, 1981, Hinckley wrote a letter to Foster proclaiming his love for her and his hope that killing Reagan would elevate his status in history enough for her to recognize him as an equal. Then, Hinckley traveled to the Washington Hilton Hotel in D.C., where Reagan was giving a speech to the AFL-CIO. As Reagan left the building and waved at the crowd gathered outside, Hinckley fired at him 6 times in rapid succession with explosive bullets. The first shot struck Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, in the head, an injury that would eventually cause Brady's death in 2014. The second round struck police officer Thomas Delahunty, while the third hit a window across the street. Secret Service agents Jerry Parr and Ray Shattuck moved quickly to push Reagan into the presidential limo, while Agent Tim McCarthy shielded Reagan with his body. The fourth shot struck McCarthy, and the fifth hit the window of the limo. The last bullet also hit the limo, but ricocheted into the president's side, missing his heart by just 1 inch. Hinckley was then tackled to the ground by Agent Dennis McCarthy, ending the assassination attempt. Reagan was driven to George Washington University Hospital, where he underwent surgery to repair his collapsed lung and remove the bullet. While at the hospital, Reagan joked about his expensive suit being ruined and told his wife that he had forgotten to duck. Despite coming close to death, he made a successful recovery. Hinckley went on trial for the almost assassination and was found not guilty by reason of insanity, prompting a significant public backlash against the ruling. After spending decades in a psychiatric hospital, Hinckley was released. Since the assassination attempt, he has expressed his remorse for his actions and his eagerness to move on in his life. He has also launched a musical career and started a YouTube channel. The President of the United States is among the most powerful and well-known people on Earth, making them a clear target for deranged attention seekers trying to send a message. While there have only been 4 successful presidential assassinations, there have been numerous failed attempts, plots, and conspiracies, some of which came shockingly close to fruition. Presidents Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Ford, and Reagan all managed to escape death's grasp for a little bit longer. All of these men, except for Kennedy, are the presidents who were almost assassinated.